Space Patrol Luluco is perfect. I just rewatched Luluco last night, and just like the first time I watched it, easy 10 out of 10. I love everything about this short. What is Luluco, you might be asking? Well, it's a 13-episode series from Studio Trigger and from the man himself, Hiroyuki Imaishi. Though it is 13 episodes, each episode is only 7 or 8 minutes long, so it's not a big series. It doesn't have a lot of time to work with to build a grand emotional connection, and yet it still does. It does it anyways. The way I like to describe Luluco, if I were pitching it to someone, is that it captures all the emotional gravity and power and strength of Gurren Lagann, except just in a fraction of the time. So let's get into why Luluco is so fantastic. To start off, visually it is just perfect, like every single other aspect of this short. Every single frame is bursting with life and energy and color. You can see how much effort was put into creating a good contrast between stuff that's lively and really animated and there's a lot of motion going on, but also having more long held shots where it's clear the emphasis is on having a very distinct, iconic imagery or framing or pose. You can see how much care was taken in thinking about how we make every single shot visually compelling and interesting and engaging. The overall visual flow of the series is really fast and upbeat, which makes a lot of sense because not only is it a short series, so it needs to convey a lot more quickly because it doesn't have as much time to really develop everything. It has to throw it all out as fast as it can so that it can cover the wealth of emotionality that I talk about. It has to be faster paced. And every single shot, there's always something for you to look at. It's really easy to just watch this and feel like you're missing things because so much is going on. And I think that's one of the things that just makes it even more fun on the rewatch because you're just picking up so much more of the little tidbits and little fast cutaways that you didn't really notice. Yet even for a first-time viewer, it's the sort of hectic insanity to it that creates a lively atmosphere that is just really fun. One of the things that really sells the visuals is the environments. The way this series is structured is that initially their hometown, Ogikubo, is stolen and put up for auction, and they have to go and find it and get it back. However, there happen to be a bunch of different Ogikubos all throughout space, and as they're searching for them, they come across all these different planets, and each of these planets has their own unique aesthetic. What you see is that each of these planets is a very clear reference to other works of Trigger. One of the planets is themed after Kill la Kill, and they even play Don't Lose Your Way. Another one is Little Witch Academia, and another one is Sex and Violence with Mach Speed. This makes it so great because the constantly shifting aesthetic gives you something to always grab onto. There's always something new to look at between the spastic pace of the visual flow just overall, but also that you're constantly getting a new style to enjoy as well. And even the original Ogikubo that they are seeking out has its own very clearly defined aesthetic too. The premise has aliens having moved to Ogikubo because Japan had to sell it off because they needed the money. And this creates a town that's a kind of weird amalgamation of just a regular Japanese city and also various sci-fi-ish elements. And it also heightens this sense of it being two worlds colliding by way of using actual photographs that are heavily edited and have lots of filters and effects put over them, mixed with actual drawn stuff. I know I complained about Yorocam having backgrounds that just look like photographs, but in this case, the contrast is a good thing. It doesn't pull you out of it because it's supposed to be weird. The whole point is that this town is a strange town, and all the planets are strange planets, and everything is weird and strange is sort of the ultimate message. Before we move on to the story, there's also the aspect of character designs, which are also phenomenal. I love everyone's design. It all looks great and beautiful. Luluco is a delightful, precious gem who is adorable, and I love what they do visually is occasionally, depending on the context of the scene, the designs change a little bit. In as much as the designs are realized in a different style that's still very clearly the character, but looks a little bit more detailed and realistic, or a little more on the cartoony end of the spectrum. But because the designs are so visually distinct and have very clear tells to all of them, it doesn't look strange when it does it, especially because the show is constantly shifting aesthetics anyways, so it's not much of a surprise that it does it with the main characters too. With the point of the expressiveness of the characters, that's one of the things I love so much, is that it feels like beyond the story, beyond the framing and the pacing, the way the characters emote tells you a lot about them, and can be compelling in and of itself. For instance, just seeing their reactions to the transformations is really funny and entertaining. Not only do you see the different ways they transform, which is funny in and of itself, but when Luluco transforms, she's always very clearly a little bit embarrassed, a little bit off-put, especially because her transformation is so strange. Whereas with Nova, he's chill and cool about it all, not off-put at all. It's just business as usual. One of the particular cuts that comes to mind, though, is when Midori changes, and her transformation sequence is very simple and quick. Her whole body shifts into a gun, and she's got this sort of smug, unimpressed grin to her that is not at all what I would expect, but then also totally fitting for her character, and it made me chuckle the first time it came up, and almost every time it did afterwards, just because of the way that one little sequence is animated. It's just so appealing and funny and goofy, and everything about the show is bleeding with that life energy. All the expressiveness of the characters tells you so much about them and makes it really emotionally compelling. And that's why when you get to the emotional climax of the series, it doesn't feel unearned, because I do feel like I've gotten to know these characters despite my time with them being so short, because it takes every single little opportunity to characterize them and make them unique and distinct from the animation to the story and the dialogue. Which brings us to the story. Now, it would be easy to disregard this series as just dumb fun, but it is a lot more than that. Luluco has a very clear message, and Luluco herself as the character has a very defined arc. And I think the message it's presenting is one that is important and compelling. It almost feels like the story being presented is very clearly from Imaishi having some sort of similar experience in the past, or at least encountering people of this nature because of how specific some of the dialogue gets. But to move forward, I am going to be spoiling things, so if you don't want to be spoiled, go watch it. It's phenomenal, great, I love everything about it. If you don't care about spoilers, then stick around and then go watch it after, because it's phenomenal and great and amazing. And if you've already seen it, go watch it again, because it's phenomenal and great and amazing. So there's sort of two central elements of the story of Luluco and its theming. On the first side, we have this aspect of normalcy. This is something Luluco seeks out, that she desires. And we see it's kind of a result of her having a very abnormal upbringing. Not only was she raised in a town full of aliens, but her parents were constantly fighting, and eventually her mother ran out on them. And this ends up with our Luluco being someone who just wants to be normal, and wants to do the normal thing, and be normal on all fronts. On the second side, we have the aspect of childlike love, first love. And this comes at the front of Luluco meeting Nova and pretty quickly falling for him. Which makes perfect sense because he's a beautiful, charismatic, confident boy that has come down from the stars, literally. And he also, to some degree, shows an interest in Luluco, or at least invites her to come into his world, in a sense, that immediately grabs her. So to address the first theme of normalcy, this is something that I think has been addressed quite often before, but the way Luluco presents it is kind of interesting. So generally, with this theme, the ultimate message is that everything is weird, pursuing normalcy is pointless because it doesn't exist, and that it ultimately holds you back from living your life to the fullest. And to an extent, this is also what Luluco presents. Her mother, for instance, is sort of the embodiment of the rejection of normalcy. She goes off and becomes a space pirate, and she's clearly very dissatisfied with her daughter when she sees her daughter is just trying to be a normal girl, even though she's quite clearly failing to do so. And when Luluco sort of shows some confidence in herself and to go out of just being subservient to others and pursuing her own desires and taking life in her own hands and not just thinking about what's right or what's normal, that's when her mother gains some respect for her and helps her out in the climax of the series. And even the OP gets at this theme of weirdness, essentially saying, everything's strange, everything's weird, cock-a-doodle-doo. However, what I like about Luluco is it takes the extra step. It goes a little bit beyond that. So the crux of this comes where her heart is stolen, and perceiving Nova as having betrayed her, and he ultimately was on the side of the villains all along, she dies. Waking up in hell, she meets Inferno Cop, and the two have a heart-to-heart where essentially he tells her a lot of what she needs to hear and gives her some advice on how to move forward. And there's one particular line he says, which is essentially, you define your own normal. And the reason I think this one line is so important is it tells you something really valuable. And that's that it's okay to have a comfort zone, and it's okay to have your own boundaries on what you want out of your life, what you want your life to be and what you don't want it to be. However, the difference with saying you should be normal and being normal is good and you define your own normal is that it tells you that it's not just about following the standard of normal and living up to that expectation. No, it's about creating your own personal standard that will give you the most meaning in your life and then living according to that. So it's not just about embracing the absurdity of the world around you because, well, that can get a little tiring. No, it's about finding what is the best way to live your life and making that your standard, making that your normal. Because we see at the beginning, Luluco is following this idea of normal, and it seems like she's simply doing so because it sounds like it's the best way to live. A 13-year-old's not supposed to have a weird life. No, they're supposed to be perfectly normal and live according to expectations and just go their day to day. But it is in finding this first love and talking with Inferno Cop that she discovers her own personal normal, her own personal values in life, and ultimately is much better off and happier because of that. So with that one side done, we have the secondary aspect, and that is first love, or adolescent love. The big climactic moment in this series comes when the Black Hole Saiyans, or Black Holians, steal Luluco's heart. This comes after her time spent with Nova and her developing infatuation with him has created this heart gem within her. And what we discover is that all along, Nova was an agent for the Black Holians, and that the Black Holians only purpose in life is to shoplift or to steal things. And as they line out, they've stolen everything of value in the world, and they've started to think, well, maybe the things that we thought didn't have value might be pretty good. And they think to themselves, well, what could be less valuable than a 13-year-old girl's first love? So, stealing the heart, they then smash it because they're evil and despicable and act out of pure chaos because they have nothing better to do. And the way they talk is why I wonder if it was inspired by any particular personal events in Imaishi's life, because their dialogue sounds very much like quoting the types of things you might hear. What is the value of a childhood love? What could be less valuable than that? It has no meaning to it, no nuance, no depth. It's based just on shallow attributes. And it sounds so much like the type of post you might see on a forum complaining about a slice of life or romance anime because it's not deep and mature enough. The whole point behind Luluco is essentially saying, no, this is extremely valuable and extremely important, and you trying to disregard that is wrong, and I'm going to show you because there's so much power in this that you couldn't have even perceived. So what happens is that when she returns from being dead after being revitalized, her heart comes back, and despite the Black Holian's attempts to destroy her heart, it just keeps coming back stronger and bigger than ever, and ultimately she uses her big heart beam on Nova, and he starts to feel. Because the thing with Nova is that he was a being of nothingness. He couldn't feel emotions. However, at Luluco's heartbeam, he gains a heart himself and accepts her confession. The reason I love Luluco so much is that it places this great weight on something that most people look back on with a fondness, to be certain, but there is a sort of feeling that it's not real, that it's not valuable. If you're thinking about a crush between kids or whatever, it's very common to see that sort of disregarded, treated lightly. And Luluco argues that it is possibly the most valuable thing. This innocent pureness to it is the foundational energy of which we find joy and happiness and meaning in our lives. There couldn't be anything better than it, and that this negative, pessimistic outlook on life just leads to nothingness, just leads to an empty need to constantly take and put others down with no real end in sight. What we see is, at the conclusion, Nova ends up having to leave this universe along with Black Holian, and Luluco sets off to search throughout the universe and find Nova once more, after he promises that they will meet again. So it's this continual searching, that this adolescent love is something that is valuable and worth holding on to and worth pursuing and seeking out. That it's not something that should just be cast aside or forgotten about. Which I find really touching, that such an empathetic point of view can be presented in such an emotionally compelling way, and with all the grandeur of the conclusion of Gurren Lagann, for instance. It's this big, phenomenal, spacey insanity that comes at the end that, through its abstraction, gives such a weight to a real concept. For me, it holds such a meaning because I've always felt a really strong appreciation for the simpler things, and do hold a value on that childlike mindset towards life. That I think it's a really important perspective to hold on to and approach life with, and it enriches one's existence. And to see Luluco present this perspective in such a wholehearted fashion is something I find unmatchably compelling. And of course, we also have the aspect that it just is a really well put together story. There's so many aspects of it that are set up earlier and pay off later. The way the whole thing is paced is really effective. It sets it up at the beginning, introduces us to the characters and to the core premise, and then it has the characters go on a big journey that lasts a while, but by way of that, gives their journey a sense of gravity, and by taking up more episodes, just makes it feel like their journey was a long one, and then pays off with this conclusion at the end. The middle stretch, people might complain that it's not always super focused on just pushing the narrative forward, but I think that's part of what makes the payoff really work, because we do get times where it's just the characters interacting in an entertaining fashion and in an entertaining setting without a focus on necessarily what's happening with the plot. And even then, a lot of these episodes do pertain directly to the emotional development of Luluco. And also on top of that, like I said, the visuals are brilliant and it's just really funny. It is a genuinely funny series. There's a lot of gags and little touches that made me laugh constantly throughout the whole thing. Even though I say it's got a very genuine, positive mindset, it also has a pretty sadistic sense of humor in some ways. It's always lighthearted and nice about it, even though the humor is kind of cruel in a lot of ways. For instance, in the opening episodes where they arrest a kid for helping other students cheat and they're interrogating him, and after he gives them the information, Nova just casually shoots him. It's hilarious. It's really funny. And it doesn't feel mean-spirited because on one front the alien doesn't appear to die. We don't really know. It doesn't say. On the second front, the alien isn't like a super fleshed out character or anything. And it makes sense in the context of Nova's personality as someone who's cold and emotionless and also kind of nonchalant about everything. And it's just funny. It is funny. And it gives this series a constant levity to it because there's so much humor going throughout the whole thing, alongside this greater emotional payoff that comes. So from start to finish, just everything about this series works brilliantly. I haven't mentioned the score, but the soundtrack is really, really strong too, even though it would be easy to miss because it's not being as overt, it's not being as up front and center. But there are some very distinct tracks, and the way the soundtrack is utilized is really effective. For instance, Luluco's theme is represented by a music box, obviously because she is the one who has this very childlike perspective. And then we see Nova's theme is this very distant, spacey synths with lots of reverb and stuff on them. And it gives it this very alien sensation. He's not of this world, and also plays into that aspect of him being more emotionally detached. And there's one particular scene where Nova is standing there being his typical detached self, not interested, not invested emotionally. And Luluco is coming on towards him, and their two pieces meet, and the second they clack together and you hear the sound effect, it shifts from Nova's theme to Luluco's, and she goes on her monologue and basically takes control of the scene. And it's this really effective scene because there's such a huge contrast stylistically between Nova's theme and Luluco's theme, which plays into the aspect of like, this is a relationship that technically shouldn't work, but it works anyways. They overcome all odds and defeat everything. And generally the soundtrack is just really strong, and it alternates between whatever musical style it needs to express the emotions, which makes sense with the shifting aesthetics and frenetic pacing. It doesn't feel jarring or weird because the whole show is weird and jarring and all over the place. It makes perfect sense in context, and it really effectively heightens everything. So Luluco is a gem and precious, and I love her. She's the best. And Luluco, the series, is a gem and precious, and I love it, and it's the best. And that's why Space Patrol Luluco is literally perfect. Special thank you to my patrons Talon, Frogus, and Roggle. If you'd like to support me on Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/korreviews. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe. And with that said, I'll see you guys tomorrow.